The shears were dull. Delia noticed this the way one notices cold water. Before the mind has caught up with the body, each cut required more pressure than the last, and Lucretia did not apologize for any of them. "Girls who steal," Lucretia said from behind her, in the particular voice she reserved for corrections, "cannot be trusted in good company. They must be made to remember it." Delia had not stolen anything. The pearl comb found that morning in her apron pocket, Lucretia's grandmother's comb, allegedly, a thing she had never seen until the moment Agnes pulled it into the light, had been placed there by hands that were not her own. She had watched Perdita brush past her in the upstairs hall not 20 minutes before the discovery, close enough for their skirts to touch, wearing that particular small smile of someone whose plans have already been set in motion. She did not say this. There was no point in saying it. The hair that fell to the kitchen floor was dark auburn, the color of mahogany in afternoon light. Old women in the village used to reach for it without thinking, their hands rising toward it the way hands rise toward warmth, toward something known and half-remembered. Her father had called it her mother's hair, the only thing Deirdre left behind that neither time nor circumstance could diminish. Her father had been wrong about that last part. When it was finished, Lucretia set the shears down and walked around to look at her. Not with triumph. Delia had braced for triumph. What she found instead was a careful, measuring satisfaction. The look of a woman who has been carrying a weight for a long time and has finally, with great deliberateness, set it down. "You will wear the cap," Lucretia said, "indoors and out. Do you understand me?" "Yes, ma'am." Delia understood considerably more than that. But she waited until the footsteps had left the kitchen before she allowed herself to close her eyes. To understand how it had come to this, you must understand what the house had been before. Gerard Stratton had been a barrister of some local reputation, a careful, methodical man, the kind who read every clause twice and loved his daughter with the same quiet thoroughness he brought to everything else. Delia's mother, Deirdre, had died when Delia was 8, leaving behind very little that could be touched. A portrait, a bundle of letters, and a particular low melody she had hummed while arranging flowers, which Delia still sometimes caught herself humming without knowing she had started. What Deirdre had left behind that could not be touched was harder to name. It had something to do with the way people paused when Delia walked into a room. Old women of the county who would stop her on market mornings and say, without preamble, that she was the living image of her mother. Lucretia, whom her father had married 3 years after Deirdre's death, had noticed this from the first week. Gerard Stratton died of a stroke on a Tuesday, surrounded by his papers without warning. What followed moved with the quiet efficiency of a plan long laid. His private will, drawn up years earlier with a London firm called Pryor and Aldgate of Gray's Inn, left the house and its properties to Delia outright, held in trust until her 25th year. A more recent will, witnessed by 2 local men, signed 4 months before his death, left everything to Lucretia's management until Delia's marriage. Delia had been visiting a school friend the week of the signing. She had thought nothing of it at the time. Within 6 months, her bedroom was Perdita's bedroom because the light suited Perdita's complexion. Within 8, Delia was no longer a daughter of the house. She was useful. She answered doors and pressed gowns and carried things and said nothing and was thanked for nothing and watched the money that had been her father's move steadily in directions that had nothing to do with her. One thing remained, her hair. Even in a gray work dress, even with her hands rough from scrubbing, people still looked. Lucretia's eyes went to it every time, with a feeling that Delia had always filed away as ordinary jealousy. She had been wrong. She would not understand how wrong until it was nearly too late. The invitation arrived 4 days after the shears. It was printed on creamstock, sealed with the crest of Ravenshollow Park, a heron in flight, and addressed to the Morrow household, which was Lucretia's. It announced that Tobias Dunraven, the Earl of Ravenshollow, requested the pleasure of the county's company for a fortnight of autumn entertainments, culminating in a ball at which, it was widely understood, his lordship intended to announce his intentions toward a wife. Perdita read it aloud at breakfast, at luncheon, and twice during supper. He was 31, and had managed the Ravenshollow estates since inheriting young, avoiding the county's matrimonial machinery with a thoroughness that had been noted and resented in equal measure. That he had opened the park and issued an open invitation meant the machinery had caught him at last. Every mother in the county was already sharpening her daughter into readiness. Delia stood in the parlor doorway and listened and felt nothing. Earls and autumn balls belonged to a version of her life that had been boxed away. Whatever happened at Ravenshollow would happen to other people. But Lucretia had gone very still, and then she turned and looked at Delia's capped head with an expression Delia had not seen before. Not satisfaction, but something older and more afraid. The look of a chess player who has just understood what piece has been moved against her. She spoke carefully. "You will come with us as Perdita's lady's maid. Every family of consequence brings one." "I have not been invited, ma'am." "Servants are not invited. They attend." Her eyes held steady on the cap. "You will keep that on. Indoors and out. You will stay to the servants' quarters, and you will not make yourself conspicuous. If you behave well, the arrangement may improve in time." Delia went. Not because she trusted the improvement, but because she was beginning to understand, in the way one understands things that have been circling for too long, that whatever Lucretia was afraid of was somehow connected to this house, to Ravenshollow, to whatever name Delia might be recognized by, and that the only way to learn it was to be there. Ravenshollow Park stood where the farmland rolled into old oak forest, and the air carried the faint salt edge of the coast. The house itself was golden stone and many windows, and it made Delia straighten her spine without deciding to. She arrived on the outside seat of the carriage, with 3 of Perdita's hat boxes balanced across her knees, and was pointed toward the servants' entrance before the carriage had fully stopped. She was crossing the forecourt, half blind behind the stack of parcels, when a groom led 2 horses around the corner of the stable block at too quick a pace. Fought. She stepped back. Her heel caught the stone edging of the border behind her. The dressing case burst open and scattered its contents across the gravel in every direction. From somewhere behind her, Perdita made a sound of sharp embarrassment. Delia dropped to her knees and began gathering. Her cap brim hid her face. She focused on the glass jars, which had survived, which seemed like the only mercy available. A pair of boots stopped on the gravel directly before her. "Allow me," said a voice, quiet, unhurried, the kind that has never needed raising to be effective. The man crouched and retrieved 3 scattered jars in one motion, set them into the open case without commentary. Delia kept her eyes down. "Thank you, sir. It was my own fault." "The horse was going too fast," he said. "I saw it." A pause. She was aware of him looking at her, not at the hat boxes or the scattered brushes, but at the cap itself, the deep-brimmed, firmly tied cap, the kind no lady's maid should need indoors. The pause lasted 1 beat too long. "Are you hurt?" "No, sir." Then Lucretia's voice arrived, sweet as icing over something cold. "Your lordship. How very good of you, but please. She's forever dropping things, I'm afraid. Don't trouble yourself." The Earl rose. "See that she has help carrying all of that," he said, and the voice had changed, set at a professional distance that had not been there a moment before. "The stone edging is poorly placed along this side." He walked away. Delia raised her eyes just far enough to watch the back of him crossing the forecourt, tall and unhurried, the crowd moving apart around him without seeming to notice it was doing so. She had just met the Earl of Ravenshollow on her knees in his gravel. He had picked up Perdita's face cream with his own hands. "Get up," Lucretia said, "all the sweetness gone. And if you make a spectacle of yourself once more, bonnet or no bonnet, I will find a use for the magistrate's office before the week is out." The servants' quarters were below stairs and behind the main house, corridors and narrow stairs and chaos. Mrs. Lorne, the housekeeper, was 60 if she was a day, and moved with the brisk authority of someone who had walked these particular stairs for the better part of her life. Delia met her on the back landing that first evening, carrying Perdita's pressed gown. "Mind the rail on the turn," Mrs. Lorne said, reaching to lift the trailing hem. "The gown will catch." The lamplight fell across Delia's face beneath the cap brim, just for a moment, just long enough. The ring of keys struck the stone floor. The crash rang through the stairwell, 2 floors deep, but Mrs. Lorne did not bend to retrieve them. She stood with one hand gripping the banister, and the color had left her face, the way color leaves a fire when the air is cut off, completely and all at once. She stared at Delia as though Delia had walked up the stairs from somewhere much further away than the kitchen. "Ma'am," Delia said, "are you unwell?" Mrs. Lorne's mouth moved twice before any sound came out. Her eyes moved over Delia's face, feature by feature, and then up to the cap, the firmly tied brim, and something there flickered, confusion running over the shop. "Forgive me," she whispered. "You look exactly like—" She stopped, pressed her lips together. "No," quietly, as though arguing with herself. "No, it can't be the same." She retrieved her keys with unsteady hands and went up the stairs faster than a woman her age should have been able to go. The door above closed sharply. Delia stood on the landing with the pressed gown over her arms, and her heart making itself known in slow, heavy beats. "You look exactly like—" "What? Whom?" Mrs. Lorne had spent the better part of 40 years at Ravenshollow Park. Delia Stratton had died in a different county entirely, and as far as Delia had ever been told, had never been here in her life. So why did a housekeeper at Ravenshollow look at Delia's face and see someone she had known? On the third evening, past midnight, with Perdita finally put to bed, Delia found the upper corridor blocked by 2 footmen maneuvering an enormous wardrobe. One of them jerked his chin toward a far door, through the East Library, down the stairs at the end. The library was long and moonlit, floor to ceiling with books on every wall. Delia moved quickly, her candle making the gilt lettering on the spines glimmer. She was 3/4 of the way to the far door when the candlelight caught a small frame on the reading table near the window. She stopped before she had decided to stop. It was a miniature portrait, the kind worn in a locket or kept on a writing desk. It showed a young woman of perhaps 25, painted with particular attention to the subject's hair, which fell over one shoulder in a rope of dark auburn, the shade of mahogany in afternoon light, the shade that was growing back right now in stubble beneath Delia's cap. She knew that face. She would have known it anywhere, from any distance, in any light. It was her mother's face, younger than any version of it Delia held in memory, caught in mid-laughter, but unmistakable in every particular. "Mama," Delia said to the empty room, and her voice broke on the word. "That portrait belonged to my grandmother." She turned. The Earl of Ravenshollow stood in the library doorway in his shirt-sleeves, a book in one hand, a man who had been reading late in his own house and had seen candlelight where it had no business being. He was not angry. He was watching her with the careful expression of someone who has been waiting for something to come into focus. She curtsied so fast she nearly guttered the candle. "Forgive me, my lord." The corridor was blocked. The footman said to come through. I know. He came further into the room. His eyes went from her to the miniature and back to her, and something in his face sharpened. You were looking at that portrait. The candlelight caught it, my lord. Do you know her? The question stood between them in the moonlit room like a third presence. And Delia, looking at her mother's painted face with her mother's own miniature sewn into the hem of her dress at that very moment. The one thing she had taken from the house the night they buried her father, heard herself say quite steadily, No, my lord, I have never seen her before. It was a lie born not of calculation but of instinct, the kind that arrives before thought, the way a hand pulls back from heat before the mind has registered the danger. The Earl was watching her with too much attention. Lucretia was somewhere in this house, and words had a way of arriving before people could prepare for them. He held her gaze for one long moment, then he nodded. The far stairs are through the second door. Take a footman's route in future. She went. At the door, she looked back. He was still standing in front of the reading table, looking down at the miniature, very still. That portrait was his grandmother's. His grandmother had kept a miniature of Deirdre on her reading table, and Delia's mother had, as far as Delia had ever been told, never set foot in this house. What she did not know was what Tobias Dunraven had been carrying in his breast pocket since inheriting the Ravenshollow estate. A letter from his grandmother, written in her last month, in handwriting that wandered as the illness progressed. It spoke of a young woman, a natural daughter of his grandmother's younger brother, quietly acknowledged within the family and never publicly named, who had spent 2 summers at Ravenshollow as a guest and had made the house feel alive in ways it had not managed since, who had been accused of stealing a set of diamond hair combs from his grandmother's dressing room, accused before the whole household, expelled before dawn, told that if she ever returned or wrote, the matter would go before the magistrates. His grandfather had arranged it. His father had known and said nothing. The diamonds had been found in his grandfather's own strongbox not a year later. Paste copies planted, the originals never removed. When his grandmother discovered this, she confronted her husband. The confrontation had gone as all such confrontations go, when one person holds every instrument of power and the other holds only the truth. She had obeyed, she had never forgiven, and she had written, Find her daughter, Tobias. What we have does not belong to us until it is paid. He had been looking for 3 years. He had almost nothing to go on. A description of hair the color of dark embers, a face people stopped to remember, and a note that she had married a barrister somewhere north and had a daughter. He had opened Ravenshollow and invited every family in the county on the logic that among so many young women, one face might answer his grandmother's description. He had found her on her knees in his forecourt on the first afternoon, and he had known it, and he had not been certain enough to act. That changed when Lucretia Morrow appeared in his study the following morning. She held a locket in her gloved hand, small gold oval, a thin chain, which she announced had been found sewn into the lining of the girl's cap. Her voice achieved the precise vibration of injured virtue. Theft, not the first time. A matter for the magistrate, she thought, unless his lordship preferred she handle it herself, quietly. Tobias looked at the locket and felt the blood leave his face. He had seen it before, or rather its twin, in his grandmother's locked writing desk wrapped in a square of blue silk, one accompanied by a note in his grandmother's hand, one for me, one for Deirdre, so she would not go away with nothing. 2 lockets, a matching pair. One had been in his grandmother's desk for 40 years. Here was the other, in Lucretia Morrow's glove, and Lucretia held it up with the confidence of a woman who has reached into someone else's belongings and chosen the most valuable-looking object without any understanding of what it is. He held out his hand for it. She had no choice but to comply. He waited until she left. Then he opened it. Inside, a tiny painted oval, his grandmother's face, 30 years younger, laughing. On the reverse, in Deirdre's handwriting, for Catherine. So you remember what this house was when we were in it. He sat with the locket in his palm for a long moment. Then he stood and went to find Mrs. Lorne. He did not find her in time. He learned, an hour later, that Lucretia had sent Delia from the house that same morning before he was out of bed, on foot on the East Road, with a carpet bag and a false charge pinned to her name. The full inventory of her crimes, as Lucretia's letter to every household in the county would have it, was already moving faster than any horse. He knew where Delia would go. Not home. Home was a closed trap. The hiring office at the port town was a possibility. But there was something else. A woman driven from every place that had ever been hers will at some point go to the one place no one can take from her. Her mother's grave. His grandmother's letter had placed Deirdre's origins in a coastal village called Carn St. Giles, 12 miles south of the port. He rode. He found her at dusk in the small churchyard by the sea. The headstone was near the far wall under an ash tree, and he knew it before he read it because there were wild flowers laid against the base, field campion and late-season clover, tied with a strip of gray fabric torn from the hem of a work dress. Delia sat with her back against the wall, her cap gone, the short dark auburn growth on her head catching the last light the way the miniature caught it. She looked like the end of a very long road, which was precisely what she was. She heard the horse and stood up slowly. "You look," she said, taking in his mud-covered coat and the 2 days of travel on his face. "Considerably worse than I do, my lord." Something in his chest loosened. The first ease he had felt since the still room. He told her the truth, all of it, standing up, plainly, with her mother's headstone between them and the sea wind in the ash tree above. He told her about the letter, the locked desk, the 40 years of his grandmother's guilt. He told her about the miniature in the library, that it was his grandmother who had commissioned it, who had kept it all those years, who had written at the end that the debt was unfinished and the daughter must be found. He told her that he had been looking for 3 years. He told her about the 2 lockets, and what was written inside the one Lucretia had pressed into his palm, thinking it evidence of theft. He told her about the will his grandmother had known about, the genuine will held in London at Prior and Aldgate, which named Delia as sole heir of her father's property and income, that the document Lucretia relied on was a forgery, that every dress Perdita wore had been bought with Delia's money, and that everyone who had spent 3 years enabling that arrangement would answer for it at law. And then he said quietly, "For Catherine. So you remember what this house was when we were in it." Delia pressed the back of her wrist to her mouth. She turned toward the headstone and set one hand flat against the stone. "I came to tell her I was sorry," she said when she could speak, "that I had lost everything she tried to save for me." She looked up, and the light was nearly gone, and her voice was wrecked and level at the same time. "And instead you came out of the dark to tell me she had already won." The truth kept its appointment, Tobias said. It was only late. They stayed that night at the inn in Carn St. Giles. His solicitor was already at Ravenshollow. The fortnight was ending, and the ball was the following evening, and every arrangement had been made. "You owe them nothing," he said, over bread and firelight. "My man can handle all of it by law. You need never be in the same room as either of them again." Delia looked at the fire for a long moment. "My mother was called a thief in a great house," she said finally. "She walked out before dawn with nothing but the clothes she stood in. She turned her head, and so was I, in front of your whole county." Something settled in her face, quiet and decided. "I'll take the ballroom, my lord." The grand ball at Ravenshollow Park began at 9. By 10, 300 guests agreed it was the finest evening anyone in the county could remember. Perdita Morrow, magnificent in white satin, received half congratulations she had not yet technically earned with a graciousness that intended to earn them within the hour. Lucretia moved through the rooms with the satisfied precision of a general who has outmaneuvered the field. His lordship, it was said, was delayed by estate matters and would arrive late. At 10 past 10 the music stopped. 300 people turned toward the great doors. The Earl of Ravenshollow entered with a woman on his arm, and the whisper began at the doorway and rolled down the length of the ballroom like water, finding a slope, because the woman was not Perdita Morrow. She wore deep blue silk, simply cut. At her collar a small gold locket on a thin chain. On her head a white muslin cap, close-fitted, the kind worn at a christening, quite deliberately wrong for a ball, quite deliberately chosen. Lucretia's recognition happened in stages, the face first, the locket second. Then the full understanding, arriving the way very cold water arrives. Tobias led Delia to the center of the cleared floor. "Before there is dancing," he said, and the room held its breath, "there is a debt to be settled, 30 years overdue, and paid in public, because the wrong was done in public." He paused. 30 years ago, a young woman was driven from this house on a false accusation of theft. Her name was Deirdre. She was innocent. The proof has been in this family's possession all along, and it will be available for examination in the library tonight alongside certain other documents that Mr. Carver of Prior and Aldgate has been good enough to bring from London. His eyes moved to Lucretia across the room and rested there, pleasant and entirely still. Her daughter has been kept as a servant in her own home for 3 years, on the strength of a will that was never valid. She was brought to this county with her identity hidden, so that no one would see what I had been looking for. He turned to Delia. His hand rose to the bow of the muslin cap, and he untied the ribbon beneath her chin with the unhurried deliberateness of something decided with care. He lifted it away. The candlelight found her dark auburn hair immediately. It caught in it from everywhere at once, the way it catches in moving water. "Look at her," Tobias said. Quietly, it carried to the walls. One breath of silence. Then, from the side of the room, Mrs. Lorne began to applaud. Alone, standing in her best black, her face open and streaming, clapping with the accumulated force of 40 years of a secret she should never have been made to keep. And then the room rose to meet it, wave on wave, until the chandeliers rang. Somewhere under all that sound, Lucretia's wine-glass reached the floor. No one heard it break. What followed was law, and law takes time, the short of it. The forged will was set aside, the estate restored, and Lucretia Morrow bit the county within the month, Perdita trailing behind, for a coastal town where a distant cousin had agreed to house them on terms that did not bear examination. They left with what the law permitted, which was very little, and left behind what the law required, which was considerably more. That night, when the doors had closed on the worst of it, and the music had started again, Tobias turned to Delia and asked if she would do him the honor. "I haven't danced in 3 years," she said. "I will tread on you." "You stood in the center of that floor without flinching in front of 300 people," he said. "I will risk my feet." She laughed, sudden and loose and entirely real, and took his hand. 2 years later, in the churchyard at Carn St. Giles, under the ash tree coming into its spring leaves, Delia Stratton became Delia Dunraven. She wore her mother's locket at her collar. She wore her own hair, grown now past her shoulders, dark auburn in shadow and nearly copper in the light, and she had stopped touching it without thinking, which was the thing she noticed most. Tobias crouched beside Deirdre's headstone afterward and set a small posy of snowdrops against the stone. "She asks me to tell you," he said to the carved letters, "that the east field is being replanted, and that the house is in better order than it has been in years." He paused, "and that she found the letters, all of them, the ones that were meant to disappear." Delia took his hand. The wind moved through the ash tree above them. The sea was audible from here, as it always was at Carn St. Giles, steady and unhurried and not unkind. They had taken her hair to make her no one. They had not considered that the woman who had nothing left to lose is precisely the woman who cannot be made to disappear.